This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Shalom. The world, of course, is very concerned about the conflict going on between the Arabs and the Israelis. This conflict goes back a long time. Obviously, there's a tremendous history to the Jewish people and a tremendous history to the Arab people and to the Islam religion. And I thought it very important that we have a little bit of a better understanding of exactly what are the dynamics of what's going on. What is the history of the Arab-Israeli or Arab-Jewish relationship over the centuries? And is there a precedent for this that would perhaps give us a better understanding of why this conflict is taking place? We have with us somebody who, of anybody I can possibly imagine, would be the greatest expert to help us to try to have some insight to this. Professor Lawrence Schiffman is the chairman of the Skirbel Department of Judaic and Hebrew Studies at New York University in Manhattan. He's well respected as a scholar throughout the world, traveled throughout the world, has been on television, spoken about many, many topics concerning what's going on with the Middle East. And it's a pleasure to have him with us today. We've had him on before, and he's always full of tremendous amount of information. So enjoy the next half hour as we delve into understanding what is the history behind the Arabs and the Jews. Professor Schiffman, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
So let's start off. And this is an area I admittedly do not have a lot of experience with, but I really want to understand what is going on over here. From your perspective, how do we better understand the conflict going on today between the Arabs and the Jews? Is this something that's been going on all along? Is there a root for this anti-Semitism in the Quran? Is there a history of anti-Semitism conflict that goes throughout the centuries? Because I was always under the impression that for many years throughout history, Jews and Arabs lived together very well.
This is really quite a complicated story, and my own view is that you have to look at it with a long view. You have to begin at the beginning of the history of Islam and understand how Islamic-Jewish relations moved from a very negative beginning to a quite positive situation in the Middle Ages and then into a period of decline, and also, of course, to understand why.
Okay, so start us off. The founding of Islam began when?
Okay, so Muhammad is born essentially in the late 500s and founds Islam in the early 600s.
Fine.
He comes to believe that he's been the recipient of a prophecy from the angel Gabriel, that he's been told basically to be a prophet, to give forth his teachings.
And he's the last of the prophets.
According to Islam, he would be the seal of the prophets,
right,
a successor to Jesus and Moses.
Okay, fine.
Now, what happens there is that he attempts, in his early days, to get a number of groups to support him. First, the Meccans, because Mecca was that shrine in pre-Islamic Arabia that he wanted very much to control and to take over as the seal even of, you might call it, the Arab prophets. Now that doesn't work initially. And he then also tries to get Jews and Christians to support his prophecy because he can't understand why not. He's just a continuator after Jesus and Moses, and it doesn't work. He then repairs to Medina, which is also called Yathrib, which is a little bit north of Mecca, and there he immediately finds himself in a major Jewish community. Now, we must understand that Muhammad absorbed many teachings from Judaism and Christianity. Some incorrectly, so for example, the Quran thinks that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is Miriam, the sister of Moses, but nonetheless, he absorbs a lot of their teachings, and he thought, therefore, that they should accept him. He gets to this place, namely Medina, and Medina is, in fact, an Aramaic word for the city, Medinta, also called Yathrib. And he's immediately confronted again by Jewish opposition. So he actually exiles and kills many Jews.
This is before he's even able to develop a following at all?
Yeah, he has a minimal following, following.
Okay.
He exiles and kills many Jews. And even follows Jews that he exiles further north to Khaybar, which is another oasis. Now then he's got the power in Medina, and he comes back and conquers Mecca. So he now controls the central shrine, makes it into a monotheistic shrine to God, Allah, the monotheistic God, and has begun his career essentially by persecuting and killing Jews. Now
this is clearly in the Quran.
It's in the Islamic historical traditions of his life.
Okay, which accompany the Quran.
Which is called the Sunnah. It's not exactly in the Quran. Now, the
It's
Quran
also considered to be
contains...
holy books.
Yes, well, these are their holy books, like their oral tradition.
Right.
What's called hadith. Furthermore, in the Quran, there is a combination of some things about the Jews that look positive, but some things that are negative. And there's a standard tradition in the tafsir, which is the commentary on the Quran, to interpret many things about treacherous people and stuff like that as these are the Jews. Now, this initial period was very bad. But ironically, when the Islamic masses came out of the Arabian desert and took over by about 638, 640, Israel, where, by the way, many people were killed, and then other parts of the known world, Mesopotamia, Iran, Egypt, what happened there was there began a development within Islam, to some extent a secularization, you might even call it a Hellenization, when they started to have a kind of renaissance, a renewal based on interacting with the Greek traditions of Aristotle, etc., that came through translation into Arabic. And suddenly you get the great Middle Ages, the period of Yehuda Halevi, the Maimonides, earlier of Saadia Gaon, and it's the period of Jewish-Muslim symbiosis, we call it, cooperation.
Sure, in so many countries.
This is the thing, right, this is the thing that we have so many authors that we're reading all the time in Jewish tradition that wrote even in Arabic. Maimonides wrote his commentary in the Mishnah in Arabic, his Guide for the Perplexed, his philosophical work in Arabic. Now,
tell me, did many of the Arabs also read those texts and draw from them?
not many, but some. Some, a small number.
So he wasn't directing his.
No, he was
his
writing.
works
He was writing for Jews. Although I want to say he did write. The Rambam wrote a few works on logic and other subjects like that, which basically are sort of, we might call them secular works, and medical aphorisms and things like that, which may have been of interest to others. But this great Middle Age period was punctuated only occasionally by anti-Semitism. But I think it's something we better remember. Jews were required to live as second-class citizens in that Islamic world, even in the Great Period. The second-class rules provided that you could not build synagogues, you could not ride horses, all kinds of things like this. You had to pay poll tax.
But were Jews used to that, though?
Jews were used to live as a second-class citizen. If they left you alone, it was okay. Don't bother me, I'm willing to be second class. I mean, we wouldn't accept this as Americans. What do you mean I'm second class? This was a good thing in those days. So they lived as second class citizens and sometimes were subject to persecution and sometimes subjected to disgrace, but nothing like some of the things that were going on in the Crusades in Europe and stuff like that. So somehow or other, it didn't look so bad.
And there was a sense of commonality also, because they traced themselves back to Ishmael, back to Abraham.
Right.
They believed in monotheism. They accepted the fact that Jews believed
Arab
in
monotheism is pure monotheism.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes,
100%.
Definitely.
And so there was
Let me ask you a question. We always trace them back to Ishmael, the son of Abraham. Right. How did Muhammad trace that back? Did he
They understand also
descendant?
because they believe that no, he just believes he's a
You're
prophet.
talking about thousands of years.
But they believe that Ishmael was the one who was supposed to be sacrificed, not Isaac.
Right.
And therefore they believe that Ishmael is the central one, and that the Arabs as a whole are descendants, and Muhammad is the leader and the prophet. He never claimed himself to be a descendant.
Okay.
Now, what happens thereafter is, starting, there was this big caliphate, like everybody was in one unified Muslim state, and then it started to break up.
Right.
The breakup was quite fast, but still the differing empires were basically in certain ways considered like states of a big Muslim empire. Beginning in about the 14th century, they began to literally fight with one another. The Christian enemies were considered less significant, and there starts to be a period of decline. And more than that, what I would call de-Hellenization or de-Renaissance, leaving the wider culture, dumping the wider culture for a closed-in, the truth be told, eventually poverty-stricken and anti-intellectual, closed Islamic culture.
Did the clergy lead that?
It was led by clergy that were what we would call more fundamentalist type clergy.
Okay.
And this was a big mistake. But this mistake continued until the decline was sufficiently great that when the European powers started to rise, so by that time the Turkish Ottoman Empire, who were Muslims, had taken over the Arab Muslims who ruled before, and you had this big Ottoman Empire, which in certain ways we now realize was a European empire. And then the other Europeans...
But how is the Ottoman Empire European?
Because it's basically Europe Turkey is basically the southern.
And it rejected the
it
primitive attitudes of the others.
Yeah, it initially rejected the primitive attitudes and tried to be a wide-ranging, and at the beginning it worked.
Yes.
And in fact, that's the era when so many Jews came to that Ottoman Empire after the expulsion from Spain.
Interesting.
Came from Safed, and they had 10,000 Jews in Safed. It's the great center where things like Lechadodi were written. You had there the author of the Shulchan Aruch,
sure.
Tremendous Isaac Luria. Now, what happened though was that as the Islamic world declines further and further, as it did under the Ottoman Empire, it began to break up. As it began to break up, they again went down that same route, closing themselves off. But now there was a new element. The new element was the real modernization of Europe, and Europe reaching out and conquering and starting these little territories. Mm-hmm. Europe gradually started to make the Near East part of the empires, the great empires. Now this begins the real modern period in the 17th century, 18th century, and this was what really brought about doom for a number of reasons. Number one, wherever the Muslims were conquered or controlled by European powers, the Jews, because they had European relatives and because they were not Muslims, quickly gravitated to those European powers and became their employees. So therefore the Jews became associated with what today is called colonialism.
So there was a resentment then from the Arabs.
Resentment started. The Jews were the first to have Western clothes. They spoke French in North Africa. They had relatives in North Africa. They had, landsmen, as we say,
right.
in Yiddish. Okay. The second stage of this problem was that Arabs failed to take advantage of modernization, especially the Ottoman Empire. They rejected all kinds of things. It didn't matter what it was. If you bought a watch from Europe, that was fine. Just don't bring me a watch repairman. Well, I mean, you can't. What do you want to watch? If we have a musket, my musket is as good as their musket, but your musket isn't as good as theirs. They rejected almost everything.
One second. How is it a total rejection? Because you go to some of these Arab countries today, and they have quite a lot of
today
modernization.
they have it, but they rejected
but back in the 1900s, they didn't have any of it?
They rejected as much as they could.
As long as they could.
And because they rejected as much as they could, as low as they could, they fell behind. And when modernization finally came, it came to a minority on the top while everybody else is left in like in Afghanistan. Now, what then happened is other new ingredients. As Europe moved closer and closer to the rise of what would become soon the Holocaust, with racial anti-Semitism and ideas like that,
right.
These ideas began to spread into the Arab world. And the state of Israel and the Zionist movement earlier than that came on the scene. And the resentment to that, all of this combined. Now, I want to explain a little this resentment, because you might say, I don't understand. If the Jews are a protected minority, as we say in Islam, why should they have a state inside the Islam? Okay, so you have to understand. According to Islam, there is an obligation to convert everyone by the sword to Islam. This obligation is undertaken through what is called jihad. And we've heard this word a lot. And it is true, as none other than Yasser Arafat says, that there is something called the greater jihad, which is not a violent thing. It's just trying to make myself a better person. Yeah. But there's also the so-called lesser jihad, which is the commandment to try and destroy people who are not part of the Islamic Empire.
Is that right from the Quran?
Yes, within the Quran. It's not really the Quran. It's actually the early traditions right after the Quran.
Okay.
Now, the point is that what happens here is that it was the belief of the early Muslims that you could raid and attack others and force them at the sword to accept Islam. And when you add to that the idea that the world is divided into the world of Islam and the world outside, and you're not allowed to have, according to Islamic law, a political entity in the Islamic territory which is not Islamic.
Right.
And on the outskirts of the territory, you're actually obligated to keep fighting jihad against the others all around you, unless you make a short-term what's called sulh, or sulha, which is a treaty. But once you get into this, what it means is that it's forbidden for them to have a Jewish political entity, not a Jewish minority, that was permitted, a political entity in the district, which is their world.
Isn't it also a matter that once land is claimed by the Arabs,
they may never give it up again. Once it's under Muslim control,
Arab
holy land may never be given back under any circumstances, no matter what is at stake. So what this means is that the rise of the idea of a Jewish national home in what was then Palestine and is now Israel is an anathema to them on a level which is totally religiously unacceptable. Then you add to that the antipathy that they absorbed not from their classical tradition, which said Jews are protected and they can't be killed, etc. What they absorbed from the combination of the colonialist experience, and they say this outright themselves, and what they absorbed from the fact that they took on so much of the anti-Semitism that Europe abandoned after the Holocaust, and you have the tinderbox, which we don't basically know how to stop from burning.
But according to what you're saying, religiously speaking, it would be impossible for them to make a peace treaty with Israel.
Unless they decide to compromise. You see, I think we have to remember one thing.
Which would take the clergy, basically, to do that, because they'd
That's
have to
correct.
find some type of permission within the law in order
That
to be able to
is
do
correct. And they don't have some of the advantages that we have of either the ability to compromise or, ironically, the fact that, I mean, it sounds almost funny to say, but we don't always listen. In the modern state of Israel, they don't always listen to the Jewish clergy.
Really?
And you know, I mean, so the fact of the matter is that in the Jewish side, there's an ability to make compromises on what you might call the religious side of the conflict. And on the Arab side, I don't want to say there's no ability, because look, Egypt and Jordan is really the best example of it, they made those compromises.
Right.
They made those compromises, and it looked for a while as if Palestinians were willing to go along with those compromises. So I don't want to say it's impossible, but it requires an orientation, which they don't have. And it requires that one, in a certain sense, bring to bear wider values and long-term, more important goals to the decision-making, whereas that is essentially what's not happening. I think we should comment right now that one of the problems that has existed is that every one of the Arab governments that we speak about has a clergy united against it. We look at Egypt and we say, Mubarak is a Muslim. To them, he is a Western sellout. And that's why Sadat was killed.
Right.
If we look at the situation recently in Ma'an, in southern Jordan, there was a guerrilla cell that was connected up with the people who killed the U.S. diplomat in Jordan. And this guerrilla cell had to be fought by King Abdullah and his men. In other words, throughout the Muslim world, with the exception of the one real Islamic government, which is Iran, the governments are opposed by the Muslim preachers.
Openly.
Yeah, and therefore, as the governments try to move to an accommodation with reality in terms of Israel, and as the governments try to move to what we would call the greater goal
Right.
from our point of view
Their
of
hands
peace
are
and
tied.
compromise, they got these guys, and they're hesitant because they're afraid of being assassinated. And we see that happen to Sadat.
So even though they're military regimes, for all practical purposes, these clergy have the free reign to be able to say whatever they want to say.
Until they get so far out of line, as in Egypt, that they kill some of them. But it still does not give, I mean, Mubarak has the freedom to continue his low-level Israeli relationship, to
Right.
consider his cold peace. But the so-called warm peace, he can't create, because a warm peace would require what we would call the hechsher, the rabbinic supervision of these clergy.
Right. Let's jump over to another topic also. The history of the word Palestinian. What exactly does that mean? We talk about the Palestinian people. When did the Palestinian people become a people, and what is the background behind these people?
Okay, first let's understand that Palestine was a designation given by the Romans, actually in the period after the destruction of the temple, to basically de-Judaize, because it was called Judea before that, the land after 70 when the temple was destroyed. And when the Christians took over the Roman Empire, they continued to use the designation of Palestine, which comes
Palestine,
from
the word Philistine.
Philistine. They occupied the area of the shore in what's today the Gaza
So
Strip.
there were a Philistine people then?
Yes.
Okay.
These people have nothing to do with those people.
Nothing at all?
No. The people that we are talking about today as the Palestinians are a people which is made up of a variety of components. There's no question. There's some small, continuous presence of people who were the ancient pagans. Yeah. The vast majority, what we call the Palestinians, are people who either entered the land during the Muslim invasions in the 7th century, when Islam took over that area. Alternatively, some of them entered the land when the Mongols and the Seljuks, between the 12th and 14th centuries, the Mongols being from literally Mongolia, and the Seljuks being a Turkic people, invaded. And then, finally, when the Zionist movement started to create the economic infrastructure of what would become Israel in the British Mandate period, there were all kinds of jobs. The economy grew like crazy. And so people streamed to what was then British Mandatory Palestine. Arabs streamed from Egypt and all these other places, which is why you got these people like Arafat was really born in Egypt, not in Jerusalem.
Right.
All kinds of people streamed there. And this is not to mention people that were left over from the Ottoman Turkish period who were Turks. Now, this combined group is the thing that we today call the Palestinians. I remember Golda Meir saying there's no such thing as the Palestinian people. And I think Israelis finally came to an understanding that whether there is or is not such a people historically,
They still have to deal with them.
you got to deal with them. But I think one of the sad things that we see is that from the point of view that we're used to, as Americans, as Jews, if you speak about the American people, you speak about the Jewish people, you speak about the French people, these are groups that are able to come together around a consensus. One of the very sad things that is plaguing the Middle East today, and Israel in particular, is that there is no consensus among the group called the Palestinians. And so you have people who genuinely want peace. You have guerrillas who want to kill anyone they can.
Right.
You have middle-of-the-road guerrillas, right-wing guerrillas. You have guerrillas controlled from Iran, from Syria, from Iraq. And so what we call a people, a consensus of individuals who share common goals and aspirations and can work together positively and creatively
Really doesn't exist.
that doesn't exist.
Now, which brings me to my next question, because as long as the Muslim clergy amongst the Palestinians are going to be ranting and raving the anti-Semitism that they're pouring out, is there any possibility for any type of peace? Because culturally, we're bringing up a whole generation now.
No, the real problem is
we're really totally against the Jewish people.
we
and
gave
have
them
nothing to do with
we
them.
gave them the schools. One of the sad parts of the problems that happened after Oslo was when we removed the so-called occupation forces, that is to say the Israeli army,
Right.
what we did was we gave them the schools, and they turned the schools into places to teach hatred,
Right.
math problems. If you kill this many Jews and that many Jews come, what happens? It's not even Israelis, it's Jews. And this is a problem. But I just want to say one thing. There is one reason to be hopeful. The only reason to be hopeful is that we have seen many other situations in the world where things could turn around in no time. And whereas this terrible situation exists, it's a situation which is encouraged and fostered by a certain kind of leadership. And we can only hope and maybe pray that the number of people who know better in the Palestinian population is large. I just want to say one thing, and I'm certainly not.
But is that for real? I mean, we
I don't
all
know.
hope and pray, but we talk about this minority, majority.
Let me tell you one thing.
Perhaps who are going to compromise but aren't speaking up.
Well, no one is going to speak up as long as the current situation exists,
Because
because
life
you
will be a
can't.
threat.
That's
Sure.
right. But let me just say one thing. The constant tips that the Israelis get to stop terrorists are coming from Arabs. Now, they get paid, but they're coming from Arabs.
Right.
And I think that the Arab population, again, we have to hope and pray that somehow or another that population represents a variety of points of view. Because if not, I have to say, if not, then we face just an out-and-out military conflict with no possibility of reaching some kind of peace. Now, if you follow the sort of underground type dealings of the Israeli government, they have been consistently negotiating with people who they thought might be such people and might come to the surface. And they have not yet been willing to come to the surface. Now, again, certain media and other things, if you read between the lines, would give you the impression that after the Iraq War and after the Israeli elections, it's very likely to happen that those forces will signal the Israelis, those Palestinian forces, to get rid of Arafat and finish off the remains of the old Palestinian Authority and give them a new chance. Now, that signal may never come, right? I can't say that.
Right.
But I can say that the Israelis are working very hard to create an environment in which those people will be able to surface. And in fact, some of those that went to the negotiations in Cairo to try and influence the Palestinians, that is, Palestinians that went, to influence the Palestinians to abandon military steps against the Israelis, seem to belong to some of those groups that the Israelis were hoping to bring about. Now, this may never happen. I don't want to make myself out as some kind
Right,
of,
no,
but
under ideal conditions, hopefully it'll come to
but
be.
this is what they're trying.
Now, I've heard of different people who are trying to reach into the history of the Arab-Jewish relationships and to try to find some type of lessons that we can take from it in order to be able to at least bring the simmer down to a cool.
Right.
Can you share any of those as far as ways that people are trying to make some bridge between the two religious groups?
Look, we have a variety of attempts. One of the more recent ones was by the chief rabbi, Bakshi Doron of Israel, the Sephardic chief rabbi, went to a religious conference in Egypt. and he met with some leaders. I myself participated in a meeting with an Ayatollah that actually concerned the problem of the Jews in Iran, which actually was a fairly successful and very interesting meeting. I say successful because we were promised then that the sentences of those Jews in Iran would be eventually reduced after some of the heat went off, and it happened.
Very nice.
So what I would say is that there are elements, a few leaders, Muslim leaders, but unfortunately the problem is that this is so far from normative that I think we need a complete reorientation. And the reorientation, and by the way, what I'm going to say applies not only to Israel and Jewish relations, it applies now to American Muslim relations. It's very clear that we need to see some major, major changes in the Islamic world. Islam has to do what Judaism and Christianity did and stress the aspects of intergroup affection and love. Because let's be honest, in Jewish and Christian traditions, it's possible to read the traditions in very different ways. As we found ourselves in a good relationship with our neighbors and they found with us, we've worked together to foster. People have to foster these relations in the Muslim world. We need to see modernization take hold there to provide jobs, to provide a culture of democracy. Now, this is something Netanyahu said during his early prime ministership, that you can only make peace with a democracy. This is very, very tough. Because in every place where there would be a vote, they would vote up the other side. They would vote for the Islamists, right?
But it seems so antithetical to the whole culture.
Right. But we've got to find ways, and I think you're going to see this with U.S. policy in Iraq. I think the U.S. realizes that you cannot avoid so-called nation building. Either we are going to leave an Iraq where Shiites, Kurds, and the rest of the people, right, the regular Muslims, the Sunnis, are going to be able to live together in peace, or it's hopeless. So I think we just have to hope that we can succeed. I just want to make one last point.
Please.
We faced, especially as Jews and also as Americans, we faced the threat of Nazism, communism, and now it's the threat that we could call Islamism, right-wing fanatical Islam.
Right.
And you know what? The other two we beat because we represent the forces of good. And the forces of good will also win out, not only for us, but for eventually for the Muslim people too, because the forces of good always do win out.
Professor Schiffman, you sound like a rabbi.
Not so bad sometimes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you very much, especially for your last words. And I think we have to have really a major effort on the part of the American public, in particular the Jewish public, to try to understand Islam a little bit better and try to reach out to the community on an individual basis, to those people who we have an opportunity to, in order to try to force some type of understanding. Because the way things are going, it's not good, and it's not healthy for anybody, and it's not going to lead to anything good. So let's hope that we can do something to make the world a little bit of a better place. Thank you very much for being with us. I always enjoy your insights into the situation. In the meantime, go out and do something in your community, in your life, in your family, in your home, to make this world a better place, because we sure need it. Take care. Shalom from the Jewish Spotlight.
Simchas hagiyulo, hine hine Moshiach bo. Sisu v'simchu v'simchas hagiyulo, hine hine Moshiach bo. Sisu v'simchu v'simchas hagiyulo, hine hine Moshiach bo. Sisu v'simchu v'simchas hagiyulo, hine hine Moshiach bo. Hine hu bo.